Greetings, I'm Ted, your ghost host, and welcome back to my channel. A channel where we will explore all things that go bump in the night. So today, we have 5 stories that are true tales of terror. So sit back and enjoy. This one takes a skeptic and turns her into a believer. It's called The Cowboy in the Mail. I never believed my grandmother. She had always told us that her house was haunted. According to her, strange things happened there all the time. Lights would flicker for no reason. Shadows would appear where nobody was standing. Sometimes she would feel a strange rush of cold air moving through the house, even when the doors and windows were all closed. And then there was the cowboy. My grandmother claimed that she would occasionally see the reflection of a cowboy in the mirrors. My brother and I thought she was just making it up. She was getting old and her eyesight wasn't what it used to be. So we figured that was probably all it was. An old woman seeing things in the corners of the mirrors and shadows. We certainly didn't believe there were a ghost living in our house. Then one day, my brother decided to scare me. I was in the bathroom, taking a selfie and combing my hair, when he suddenly came up behind me and screamed, "Boo!" I jumped out of my skin. He thought it was hilarious. I was still standing there a few minutes later trying to calm down when I thought I heard him creeping up behind me again. I didn't turn around. I figured he was going to try it again. I waited. Then I felt something cold against the back of my neck. It wasn't my brother. It felt like a slight breeze. I turned around and there was nobody there. I remember thinking it was strange, but I didn't really think much of it. I left the bathroom and started walking down the hallway. Then I glanced over my shoulder. There was a mirror in the hallway, and in that mirror, I saw someone stand behind me. It looked like a cowboy. I froze. I could see him in the reflection following me. I immediately spun around and there was no one behind me. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was gone. My first thought was that my brother had somehow managed to pull another prank on me. So I called for him. He came running in from the living room. He hadn't been behind me. He hadn't been anywhere near me in the bathroom. For the first time, I started wondering if my grandmother had been telling the truth. But I didn't want to believe it. I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. Later that night, my brother and I were sitting together in the living room when the lights started flickering. We looked at each other, and suddenly a huge gust of wind rushed through the room. It was strong enough that we both noticed it immediately. But there was something wrong. All the windows and doors were closed. There shouldn't have been any wind. We waited. It happened again. At this point, neither of us wanted to stay in the house anymore. We got out, and after that day, my brother and I avoided going to our grandmother's house whenever we could. The strangest part is that my grandmother had been telling us about the cowboy for years. She had seen him in the mirrors. We laughed at her. Then we saw him too. Only I didn't see him standing in the room. I saw him stand behind me, in the mirror. And when I turned around, there was nothing there. Well, off the top of my head, I'd say that you and your brother owe your grandmother an apology. Next up, we have one from someone that claims to have seen the reflection of a huge shadow of a person that was standing in the living room. But that's okay. It seems that he also had a couple of witnesses. This story is called The Shadow in the Living Room. This happened on October 26, 2016. It was sometime around 8 o'clock in the evening. I was walking into my living room when I noticed that all three of my dogs were at the back door. They were barking because they wanted to be let outside. The back door was made almost entirely of glass. There were two large glass panes beside it, and because the lights inside the house were on, the glass reflected the room behind me almost perfectly. I was about to open the door for the dogs when something strange happened. They stopped barking. All three of them stopped at exactly the same time. They weren't looking at the door anymore. They were looking towards something to my left. I didn't understand what had gotten their attention, so I looked in the same direction. And then I looked at the reflection in the glass. That's what I saw. There was a figure standing in the corner of my living room. It was completely black. Not a person wearing black clothes, not someone standing in the shadows. It was like a solid black shadow in the shape of a person, and it was huge. I was about 5'7" at the time, and this thing towered over me. Even though its shoulders were hunched forward, it was still considerably taller than I was. For several seconds, none of us moved. The dogs just stared at it, and I stared at it. I couldn't understand what I was looking at. Then something happened that scared me more than anything else. The figure seemed to notice that I was staring at it. It moved. It went from the corner and disappeared into the hallway. I didn't chase it. I didn't investigate it. I just stood there. I was completely frozen. I remained in that same spot for about 5 minutes. Eventually, I started trying to figure out what I could have seen. Maybe it had been my own shadow. Maybe there had been something outside the house that had created that reflection. Maybe the lighting had made something ordinary look strange. So I tried to recreate it. I tried several times afterwards to make my own shadow reach the same spot on the wall. It couldn't. My shadow could not reach that far. It wasn't dark enough, and it wasn't large enough. Whatever I had seen didn't match my own reflection, and there was something else that bothered me. I hadn't been alone when I saw it. My 3 dogs had seen it too. They had been staring directly at the same place before I even noticed anything. I've tried to come up with an explanation ever since. I still don't know what it was. I only know what I saw. And what I saw was a huge black figure standing in my living room. Then, it walked away. Well, look at the bright side. At least you had witnesses. Sure, it may have only been dogs, but witnesses nonetheless. Our next one takes us all the way to Mexico, where someone tells us of an encounter they had when they were a kid. This one's called The Figure on the Haunted Bridge. I was about 12 years old when this happened. I was walking with a group of friends through an area near my hometown in Mexico. The place already had a reputation. People said it was haunted. There was a bridge that separated 2 different houses, and near the bridge was a huge tree. People told us that strange things happen, especially after dark. They said people sometimes saw figures. Sometimes they saw shadows where nobody was standing. There was also stories that someone had been killed there. I didn't know whether any of that was true. Honestly, when we went there that night, we weren't expecting anything to happen. We were just walking around with our friends. Then we reached the area near the tree, and that's when we saw it. At first, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. There was a huge shadow standing directly in front of us. But there was something strange about it. It wasn't just a normal shadow. It looked as though the shadow itself was covered with something white. Almost like a white cloth hanging over it. And all of us saw it. It wasn't one person saying, "Hey, look over there." And everybody else imagining something afterwards. We were all looking at the same thing. Then the figure moved. It didn't walk away. It rose up. The shadows seemed to fly upwards into the tree. That's when everyone started screaming. We were terrified. Some of us started crying. So we ran. None of us stayed behind to figure out what we'd seen. For me, the fact that everyone else seen the same thing was almost as frightening as the figure itself. If I'd been alone, I could have told myself that I just imagined it. Maybe I misunderstood a shadow. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe the darkness had just played tricks on me. But there were several of us, and we all seen the same thing. Afterwards, I kept thinking about the stories we heard about the tree. I've heard that someone had been killed there. So I started wondering whether the thing we seen was connected somehow to those stories. Maybe it was supposed to be the ghost of someone who had died there. I don't know. I never found out. That night was the first and last time I ever experienced anything like it. I've gone years without return to that area. I don't even know if people still say it's haunted, but I'll never forget what we saw that night. Whatever it was, we all saw it. I wonder how many of you or your friends needed therapy bills after seeing this. Our next one takes us off to the Big Easy, New Orleans, where a couple people have an encounter with a ghostly boy. It's called The Little Boy in the Doorway. My sister and her friend were staying at an old house in New Orleans. They already knew there was something strange about the place. The house had a history. And as they spent more time there, they began feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Eventually, they decided they didn't want to stay. They got into their car and they started to drive away. They hadn't gone far, then my sister suddenly became uneasy. She told her friend that she had the feeling that someone wasn't happy they were there. Her friend initially thought that was strange. He said it wasn't like my sister to talk that way. But then something happened that changed both their minds. They looked back towards the house. And there, standing in the doorway, was a little boy. They both saw him. He was wearing what appeared to be a camouflaged military uniform. There were buttons and badges on it. He had short, blonde hair. And they could clearly see his face. He looked extremely young. They were sitting in the car, looking back through the glass of the doorway. The house wasn't far away, so they could see him clearly. Neither of them immediately tried to explain what they were seeing. They simply stared. Because there was one problem. They both saw. It wasn't just my sister. It wasn't just her friend. They were looking at the same little boy standing in the exact same place. Eventually, he drove away, but they couldn't stop thinking about him. So, they decided to investigate the history of the house. They started researching the property, they researched the street, they researched the neighborhood. And that's when they came across something that made the experience even stranger. The house had apparently been used as a refuge during World War II. And according to the history they found, there had been a little boy connected to the house whose father had been a soldier. The two women began wondering whether the boy they'd seen had been wearing his father's military uniform. They couldn't prove that's what happened, but the coincidence was difficult for them to ignore. Then they discovered something else. They weren't the only people who have reported seeing a little boy associated with the house. Other accounts existed describing a child appearing there. That was when the experience stopped feeling like an isolated hallucination to them. They had seen the boy. They had both seen him. And afterwards, they found a history that seemed to offer a possible explanation for what they witnessed. Whether they had actually seen the ghost of a child who had once lived there, or whether there was another explanation. They never knew. but neither woman forgot the little boy standing in the doorway. Wow, to think of that child spending the rest of eternity as a ghost, staying there by himself, all alone, just makes the story even more tragic, doesn't it? Next up, we have a story from someone that had an experience in a cabin when they were a kid. An experience they're not too soon to forget. The story is called The Viking in the Cabin. Okay, so I grew up on an old farm. There was a log cabin there, and this log cabin had actually been built over older property. And there had always been stories about the cabin. Growing up, I was used to hearing about the spirits. So when I say there were strange things happening around the cabin, I'm not talking about one isolated incident. There were a lot of them. But there's one that has always stuck with me. I was getting ready for bed one night. My mom wasn't home yet. I was by myself in my room. It was dark and the house was quiet. The floors in the cabin were very old and they creaked all the time. I got used to hearing them. Then I heard one of those creaks coming from the hallway. I just figured it was my mom who had finally gotten home. I wasn't worried about it. A few seconds later, the bedroom door opened. I could see my mom's shadow in the hallway. At least, that's what I thought it was. I remember thinking, why isn't she turning on the light? It was dark enough that she could have easily tripped over something. But she didn't turn the light on. Instead, the figure started coming towards me. And as it got closer, something happened that I still can't really explain. The outline of that person changed. It wasn't my mother anymore. The shape of the body seemed to transform right in front of me. And what I was looking at became something completely different. It was like a Viking, a huge, frightening man, and he had a massive axe. That's when I realized that whatever was standing in the doorway wasn't my mother. I don't remember thinking about what it could be. I don't remember trying to figure out how it got there. I was just terrified. Because a moment earlier, I thought my mom had come home. I'd seen her shadow. I expected her to walk into my room. Instead, the figure standing over me had transformed into something that looked like a huge Viking carrying an axe. and I was alone in the cabin at night. The whole thing happened so quick that I don't even know how long I was looking at it. But I remember the feel. I remember knowing that whatever I was looking at wasn't my mother. And that's the thing about the old cabin. There were always stories about spirits there. I'd grown up with them, but when you're a kid, stories are one thing. Seeing something standing in your doorway is something else entirely. And I never forgot that Viking. I don't blame you. I think that story terrified me. In fact, I'm fairly certain I may have wet myself a little. And for a ghost to wet himself, well, let's just say that gets real messy real fast. Well, I do believe that's all we have for right now. Thank you for being brave enough to make it all the way to the end. While you're here, if you could be kind enough to hit like and subscribe and to share this video, it really helps my channel out. Until next time, remember, beware of all things that go bump in the night.